Hello, my fellow geeks. Welcome to episode number 30 for the Indian AvGeek, and you are listening to Vishal Mehra. Couple of days back, IndiGo finally announced its entry into European skies, confirming Manchester and Amsterdam as its debut routes. The gentleman we have on the show this week knows a thing or two about IndiGo and how. We have the privilege of welcoming a true veteran of the aviation world to the Indian AvGeek. Willy Boulter's career has been nothing short of adventurous, with leadership roles spanning some of the biggest airlines in the industry, from taking off at Cathay Pacific in 1979 to South African Airways, to Virgin Atlantic, to Gulf Air, to IATA, to Etihad and Jet, to TAG Angola, and finally landing at IndiGo in 2018. His journey is a testament to expertise and passion. I couldn't be more pleased to welcome you to the Indian AvGeek, Willy.
Thank you very much, Vishal. It's a pleasure to be here this evening.
The pleasure is all mine. Let's start with you getting in the business. What got you into aviation in the first place?
Well, it was really an unlikely development, I suppose. I mean, I was leaving university. I was at Oxford in the UK and, considering what to do. And I was actually an army officer at the time. And I had the option of going back into the army. But things in that world were not great at the time. Investment in the armed forces had been going down for a long time. And so I applied for a job which would take me overseas. And one of the jobs I applied for was John Swire and Sons in Hong Kong. And I was fortunate enough to be selected, and I went to Hong Kong. And they run a diversified conglomerate, which includes sort of shipping, properties, and of course, Cathay Pacific. And basically, they assigned me to Cathay Pacific as a management trainee. And I had a fantastic 20 years there in the end before I left. So, I didn't have a great ambition necessarily to work in airlines, but that's just the way it worked out. I could have been in the shipping industry, I guess. But I'm happy I went the way I did.
So everything you learned about airlines and aviation was on the job at Cathay?
Yes, pretty much. I mean, they had a fairly intensive training period for sort of 3 or 4 months where we basically did, reservations and ticketing courses. We did cargo services course, I remember. We even got a load sheet license. So they put us in with, everybody in every department. And we learned, a number of the basic sort of skills of running an airline. And then we were sent out to various outports in the Cathay system. And I actually went to Manila for my first year, and then to Japan for my second, and then back to Hong Kong head office for my third year. And they had a policy then of basically giving you a 3-year contract, and you did 3 different assignments within that, while they figured out if you liked, they liked the airline business and they liked you. And then they would offer you a permanent contract after that.
I suppose the first rodeo for you in the Indian market would have been in 2012. Will that be right?
No, actually, I was here with Cathay fairly early on in my career. I came to Mumbai, or Bombay as it was then, in the late 80s. Well, I say late 80s, mid 80s. I was there from 84 to 87-ish. And yes, that was my sort of first experience of India. But I'd grown up with India to a degree in that my father was an officer in the old British Indian Army and fought through the war with the Jawans from the 1st Punjab Regiment. And then as I was growing up, we had visitors in the house from India and Pakistan. He had very close relationships, obviously, with a number of Indian officers who'd served with him during the war. So India, in that sense, wasn't a complete surprise to me.
So all of that was pre-liberalization of the Indian economy.
Yes, yes, very much. It was very much, the peak of the license Raj.
I have a related question for you, something we were discussing during our phone call earlier, but I will come to that later. Let's go to 2012. This is the time when you have joined Etihad and you've been tasked with going to Mumbai and work with Jet Airways as part of Etihad's investment in the airline. How was it working on both sides?
Well, Etihad, of course, was going through a massive expansion and was investing in airlines, in Asia and in Europe, and took as part of that 24% of Jet Airways, and really, at the time, saved Jet Airways because they were already pretty shaky, and it gave them some survival, as it were, for a few
Yeah,
more years. But
yeah.
I mean, when I was at Jet, I could see very clearly, that the model that Jet had was unfortunately, being beaten by Indigo in the domestic market. I remember sitting in the back of a taxi in Mumbai with a colleague and seeing this Indigo hoarding saying 5 flights a day to Srinagar. And I
From
remember
Mumbai.
pointing at that. Yeah, I mean, it was
Wow.
not from Mumbai, but from all over India. By then,
Yeah.
they were flying 5 a day, I think it was, to Srinagar. And I said to my colleague, I said, those guys have really, they're going to eat our lunch, because they were adding frequency quite quickly, and the whole Indigo model was so much better suited to the Indian market than the jet model, which had done very well in the narrowed body days, the 1990s, when frankly the only competition was Air India, um, and one or two other airlines would come up from time to time. But it had passed its use by date, by the time I arrived at Jet, and we urgently needed to change the model. But in the end, we didn't have control, and so the decisions weren't taken that needed to be taken.
The interesting thing about that story is that merely 6 years later, you were part of that lunch eating team at Indigo, probably expanded to even eating dinners by then.
Well, I certainly enjoyed working, with my colleagues at Jet, and yes, two or three of them turned up in the commercial world in Indigo a bit later, which was great.
And how was Naresh Goyal to work with?
Well, I mean, Naresh and I, we developed a friendship, obviously, and I've known him actually since I was first in India in the mid '80s, and so we had a good relationship. But I think the business, by the time I was working in it, the business was under so much stress, because of Indigo, number one, but also even the wide-bodied operation was not in great shape either. So yes, I mean, obviously Naresh was the boss, and he called the shots. Um, so yeah, I'll leave it at that.
The Air Sahara acquisition really turned out to be the last nail in the coffin for Jet Airways, unfortunately.
Yes, I mean, I can't claim to
Okay.
be, a historian of Jet in great detail, but I would say that decision, and the whole sort of confusion of brands between Jet Light and Jet Connect and Jet Airways, was a mistake. And the other decisions which really handicapped Jet was, when he took 22 wide-bodied aeroplanes within about 18 months. 10 777s from Boeing and 12 A330s from Airbus, and I think that the cash requirement, of that, changed what was a very profitable narrow-body domestic airline, it dramatically changed the balance sheet, and I think, you know, contributed to the downfall because Jet never really recovered from the amount of debt and so on that had to be taken on to fund those purchases or those leases. Um, anyway, it's all history now, but interesting how things turn out.
So you joined Indigo in the April of 2018 as the Chief Strategy Officer, soon after promoted to Chief Commercial Officer. How is it working at Indigo? And looking back, what do you think made it such a massive success story?
Well, Indigo, uh, everybody can see, I think, and certainly when I joined, I mean, we had around just short of 200 aeroplanes, I think it was, and Indigo had a very, very consistent model, founded basically in terms of on-time performance, obviously courteous, hassle-free service, and you know, very affordable pricing. And this is what the fast-growing Indian market needed at the time. And I think history will show that that was a brilliant model to introduce, and it had some excellent attributes to it. The very fact that all the cabin crew are female, which automatically makes the aircraft lighter. The lack of ovens on board, again, saving weight, saving maintenance, not really required for short haul services anyway. And the focus on quick turnarounds, which enabled very high aircraft utilization. The model was really a very brilliant model, I think, and still today there are probably many aspects of their short haul operation which owe themselves to the original decisions taken when the airline was founded.
And those two brilliant men behind the airline, Rahul Bhatia and Rakesh Gangwal. How is it working with both of those gentlemen?
Well, I mean, I've known Rahul for 25 years or so, since I was with South African Airways briefly in 2000, 2001. So we go back a long way, and I've always admired him as a man and as a Indian entrepreneur. He has a fantastic way of looking at the world, which is quite different actually to, say, a Naresh Goyal or many other Indian entrepreneurs. I mean, Rahul is really a fantastic person, and he's guided Indigo, from nothing. It was all his vision to found it, and he took immense care, interviewing cabin crew individually himself in the early days. He took immense care with the airline, and of course still does. And I have the highest of respect for him. Rakesh Gangwal, uh, again, as an airline person, a pure airline manager or chief executive. I mean, I think he has probably no peer in the world. I mean, of all the people I've met along my 40-year career in airlines, and I've met most of the chief executives one way or the other through IATA meetings or whatever it might be. Um, Rakesh Gangwal, to my mind, stands out. I mean, he brought to Indigo, the absolute focus on detail, the focus on cost, and more than that, the ability to see what was, significant and what wasn't. And I'll just tell one sort of small anecdote about Rakesh, that he, a year before, I mean, when I just arrived, I remember there was a management discussion of which he was part of, and we were talking about Jet Airways, and a full year before Jet went out of business, and no one kind of imagined that Jet was going to go down. I mean, we knew they were in trouble, but he basically said, "Yeah, don't worry about Jet." He said they won't be here; they're going out of business. and he had that foresight. And as I say, that I just tell that as one anecdote. I mean, he does have brilliant foresight in my mind, and he knows the airline business like nobody else.
Well, Southwest Airlines clearly lucked out in having Rakesh Gangwal on their board now, and that airline clearly can use some of his wisdom. Willie, do you see today's Indigo very different from what you inherited and what you retired from?
Well, time moves on, right? I've been away from Indigo now for 2.5 years. Obviously, I still have friends there. I still know something what's going on. I see what the press releases and so on, but I have no kind of inside knowledge. I mean, it's basically being managed by a very good team under Peter Elbers, and I think it's a different airline, obviously, to the one I joined, where at the time our focus was very much on expanding that model of A320, A321 flying in India, but also about 25% of the ASKs by the time I left were international sectors. So, but it was all very much, on that classic low cost or Indigo model as it had been set up. In fact, I spent considerable time at one stage arguing against getting wide-bodied aeroplanes in and developing hubs and doing sort of the more sort of full-service carrier type thing, because I knew that the Indigo model was a very, very profitable business, and to sort of go away from it at that time was not the right idea. And I think at one stage we were on the verge of leasing some wide bodies, and I'm going back to sort of 2019, and those aircraft would have arrived in about March or April 2020, just as COVID hit. So in a way, it was a lucky escape, I think. But that's what happens in the airline business. I mean, you make some decisions, they come right, and others don't. But as I say, together with the finance department, we were very resistant to the idea of changing the model at that point.
Very interesting. Which wide body aircraft were you guys planning to induct that time? I remember there was talk of using Tbilisi also as a sort of a mini hub to launch further in Europe as well.
Well, I think it was reported in the press at the time that we were looking at wide-bodied aeroplanes, and obviously out of India, everybody looks to Europe initially. So we were looking at Europe. The Tbilisi plan and all that was actually based on the narrow bodies, where we were thinking of maybe pushing A320s or A321s through a midpoint into Europe at one stage. But then planning departments, and airlines look at all these things, and it's only in India that it comes out into the press. So yeah, I mean, you'd not be doing your job if you weren't looking at various
Sure.
options. Yeah.
Sure. One last point on that. I'm guessing the wide body you were looking at that time was the A330?
Well, I mean, I don't want to go into the specifics of it.
Okay.
I don't think there's any point. It was some years ago.
You had Air India as a competitor during your time at Jet Airways and more importantly, Indigo as well. How do you see the Air India of old versus the new Air India of today?
Well, I would go back even before that. When I was at Cathay, Air India was our competitor to Hong Kong. And I've known Air India since I was a kid, actually. I remember here in England growing up. At that time, in the sort of mid-late 60s, early 70s, Air India had a fantastic reputation. And I always remember reading of their success in winning an award for the best airline out of London on the transatlantic. They operated at that time a Heathrow JFK service on the 747. And it was still at the time under the chairmanship of JRD Tata, although it was already government owned by then. But he was a great figure in the airline business as well as many other businesses. But he for sure got Air India up to a fantastic standard. And then, of course, after he left, then it just went downhill very quickly. And by the time I was in India in the mid-80s, it was already an airline that you didn't really want to fly. And that just continued. I mean, what I will say is that from a operational point of view, an engineering point of view, I think Air India was fine. But from a service point of view, it went downhill very, very quickly. And, it was a moribund sort of organization for decades, really. And they missed an ideal opportunity, which was to build India as a hub between Asia and Europe. And for years afterwards, all the bureaucrats would complain about Emirates and Qatar, and then more latterly Etihad and so on. They'd complain about, why is the hub in Dubai? It's not in India. Well, the reason is that you missed the obvious opportunity. I mean, when I was in Cathay back in head office in the not even in India, I remember my seniors talking about it, saying, "Can't believe that Air India have missed this opportunity." And of course, Emirates took it. And from 1985, onwards, Emirates, under the leadership of Tim Clark and others, they took it with both hands. But it was there for the taking, but by Air India, but it never happened. So yes, I mean, time went on. Air India, losing money year after year. Although some will claim it made money in 1 or 2 years, possibly, I don't know. But they were never really a serious competitor. The time I was at IndiGo domestically, well, let's go back to the time at Jet. Certainly at Jet, we never really thought of them as significant competition. We knew that whichever services we had, where they had parallel services, we knew we would beat them in the market on the wide body front, and especially in the front end in the business class and first class, of course. And then at IndiGo, we very rarely looked at Air India as a substantial competitor. I mean, I think their market share at the time domestically was something like 12, 15%, something like that. And so again, we never looked at them. We worried more about the other players in the market, like SpiceJet to an extent, and 1 or 2 others, but certainly not Air India.
Would you mind sharing that Air India anecdote you were telling me during our phone call when we were discussing Air India's recent move to Haneda from Narita?
Yes, I mean, I think a good example of how moribund an organization it was at the time, and I don't want to be too tough. I mean, people tried to do the best they could, and I'm sure, the staff, many of them were very talented and very, very good staff. And as I've said, the engineering side and so on, seemed to work pretty well. But just an example of how Air India missed opportunities was in Japan, where as soon as Haneda expanded its number of runways, a huge number of slots became available over 2 or 3 years. And practically every airline flying into Tokyo at once looked at trying to move their operations from Narita to Haneda, because Haneda is 20, 25 minutes from downtown Tokyo, whereas Narita is sort of 75, 90 minutes, depending how you get there. So it's an obvious thing to do, but I was told, and I don't know, I can't say that this is 100%, true, but I was told that they didn't move and didn't want to move, even though the Japanese carriers, ANA and JAL, in the interest of fairness, came to Air India and said, look, we are planning to move our India operations to Haneda. We will give you some slots in the sort of cooperative way the Japanese do these things. And Air India turned them down. And they turned them down because the crew said, no, we like Narita. There's a nice Indian restaurant in the Narita town, and we like the hotel and so on, and we want to stay there. So I was told this story, and I have to say I believe it, although some may dispute it. But I'm delighted to see that finally they are moving to Haneda, and it's something that should have happened years ago, before well before the Tatars took over. But it's good that they finally achieved this.
Astoundingly classic Air India. What's your take on IndiGo being so impatient, especially with their wide body operations? We now have confirmation on their initial routes to Europe, Manchester and Amsterdam, that they will be flying on the Norse 789s. There's already one flying to Bangkok for now. You also have the 777s wet leased from Turkish. What's your take on all of this, Willy?
Well, I think clearly the strategic move is to get into the wide-bodied market and provide a competitor to Air India. I mean, India is such a vast economy and has such a potential growth over the next decade or two or three. That there is room for two substantial airlines on the international circuit coming from India. You can look at many other economies and see that they generally support two international airlines. So I've been talking about Japan. Obviously, there's JAL and ANA, both very significant airlines. You can look at the UK. You've got British Airways, which is a huge airline. You've got Virgin Atlantic, which is actually quite a small airline, around 35 aircraft, all wide bodies, but punches above its weight and does extremely well in that transatlantic market. And you've got in Australia, you've got Qantas, and again, similar to the sort of BA Virgin issue, you've got Virgin Australia is still very small internationally, but I think there's space for it to grow. And actually, Australia is a very, very small economy compared to India. So there's no doubt that there is space for obviously a revitalized, revived, reinvigorated Air India and an IndiGo, ambitious IndiGo, acquiring basically the 350s on a firm order, and obviously taking these leases in the interim. And I think you can call it impatient, but there's definitely space in the market. And I think the other, again, publicly written about on several occasions, there's no secret that the Indian government has been pushing airlines to correct this sort of Middle East hub issue, and start providing capacity ex-India directly into North America, Europe, Australasia, and so on. So I think IndiGo, has I mean, it's done fantastically well over the last 2 decades, and they obviously want to expand into the international market.
I want to go back to 2019. You mentioned that you were not a big fan of wide bodies joining the IndiGo fleet. If you look at the IndiGo of today, you have ATRs at the regional level. You, of course, have the 320 and the 321s as the backbone of the fleet. You have the 777s and 789s on wet lease. Everybody knows 350s are coming. If IndiGo's persuasion, let's say that, with Airbus does take place, one can expect those 350s to start arriving next year instead of 2027, and you have XLRs arriving by the end of this year. My question to you is that having a smorgasbord of different aircraft types right now, does that betray the LCA model that IndiGo built itself on?
Well, I don't think it's a question of betrayal. I think it's just it's an evolution, and I think indeed Peter Elbers has been quoted as saying, we're probably no longer a low cost airline. We're a hybrid, and you can call it what you like actually, but as I say, it's just responding to this enormous opportunity in India, and the market, is almost limitless. I was looking at China the other day, and somebody mentioned to me there are 900 million people in China who've never taken a flight, and actually the same roughly applies in India too. So there's, of course, the economy has to grow and incomes have to go up, etc. But fundamentally, there is still enormous potential, and you're seeing that, and obviously people are recognizing that, and so that's why the orders have been put in by Air India and by IndiGo in particular, to acquire hundreds of aircraft because they will be needed, and I think the future Indian aviation is pretty bright.
Excellent to hear that from you. Do you think IndiGo will have a scissor hub in Europe like Jet Airways did in Brussels?
Yeah, I mean that scissor hub at Jet didn't work that well. I mean, I think it had, it was a good idea on paper, but the problem with hubs is that actually you need a good hub market as well. You can't, and the experience from the States shows this. You need, any hub needs a good origin destination market into that hub, as well as all the connecting traffic. So if you'd had that scissor hub, somewhere like CDG perhaps, or I mean you'd never get it at Heathrow, you wouldn't get the slots. But if you had it in a very significant market, it would have been probably much better than it was. I mean the route that did best was actually into Toronto. The route into New York, and into, JFK and Newark, none of them were great performers. And a big reason for that was that you didn't have a lot of O&D traffic going into Brussels. You needed some traffic getting off at Brussels and new traffic getting on, and that just wasn't there, because Brussels is a small market out of India. Equally, it's a relatively small market out of the US. And so you didn't get this exchange of traffic, which would have led to much higher yields and would have made that hub work better. So I think it's an important point that hubs, everyone thinks they're wonderful, especially people outside the airline business, but they don't realize that you need a good market to base a hub on, as well as having a network. And that's why you've seen Emirates, for instance, spend a lot of time developing Dubai as an origin and destination market, so that 35% of their traffic actually ends up in Dubai, or is originating Dubai. Qatar have not done the same thing, but they, about 15% only of their traffic ends up in Qatar. And the problem with that is that it means your yield per available seat kilometer is just lower. Yeah.
There has been lots of speculation where IndiGo will fly its A350s, whether it'll be Europe only, or they might fly to Australia, or even the US East Coast. Of course, the makeup of the aircraft for ultra long haul ops will have to be different. You'll have to include crew bunks, etc. Which stations do you think IndiGo will look to open with those? Do you think they will eventually fly to Australia and America?
Well, I think that's quite a hard question to ask me because obviously I'm not involved anymore, and I'm not in the business of second guessing the current management. I mean, anyone who's worked in an airline knows, how frenetic an environment it is, and how difficult it is sometimes to make network planning decisions. But I'm sure that the great team there will come up with some pretty good destinations for the 350. I mean, obviously they'll look at the biggest markets out of India, and potentially markets that are currently underserved. They'll make decisions for the right reasons, I'm sure. Yes, Europe, obviously, and I would think Australasia potentially. I know that Air India have operations down into Sydney and Melbourne, but there may be other opportunities there. And I hope, for selfish reasons, that Japan comes into the network, because I think there's an opportunity to make money sort of going into Northeast Asia as well as Europe, and who knows, perhaps South Africa. So IndiGo have got a host of opportunities, and as I've mentioned, the size of the Indian market, and not just the size of the market, but the number of good origins in India. You've got more than just one capital city. You've got obviously Mumbai. You've got Bangalore is an increasingly attractive place to operate internationally. Has, of course, huge domestic network out of Bangalore. You've got Chennai, again in itself a pretty large market, and then you've got probably Hyderabad and Kolkata as smaller but again significant markets. So you're not spoiled for choice, really. I mean, I think there'll be a very good network built by IndiGo using those 350s, which of course give them good range, and are a good product. So I think the Indian public should look forward to the introduction of IndiGo's long haul with some anticipation.
On that point, I've had conversations where I've been told that if Indigo wants to open up Australia, they can do so via Chennai, flying to Perth on the XLRs coming up. So, interesting times ahead, definitely. My last question to you on fleet. Do you believe IndiGo needs a bigger regional aircraft fleet? They have about 50 ATRs right now. I think some of them are retired, so maybe less than 50. Do you think there is a chance for somebody like Embraer to come in and make a play?
Well, of course, Embraer have had recent success with the Singapore Airlines group, with Scoot.
And as well as ANA recently, I think 4 days back.
Yes, indeed, and ANA. So I'm sure they'll keep trying, but I do think there is a cost to having too many aircraft types, and sometimes you're better off, as we used to say at Cathay, you're better off making intelligent misuse of aircraft than you are getting an entirely new type. So there may be routes where an A320, with 180 seats or 186 seats, whatever it is now, that is a little bit big, but better to use that than to buy an entirely or lease an entirely new type. And I think people forget that markets, and especially in India, you could start a market with an A320 and feel that it's too large for the market, but it's only a year or two at the 8, 9, 10% growth that you're getting domestically. It's only a year or two before demand catches up with the aircraft. So I think you're far better off trying to keep the fleet as simple as possible. And the ATR, I mean, people had the same question when the ATRs were brought in, which happened just before I arrived at IndiGo. There were many questions. Oh, why are you doing this? It's not in your low-cost model, et cetera, et cetera. But actually, the ATR fleet was fantastic in the sense that it could bring passengers connecting from small cities, especially in South India, into Hyderabad or into Bangalore and connect with the A320 fleet. And it was a very, very powerful weapon, I think, in terms of growing the network at a pretty low cost, and providing, putting IndiGo into a whole range of smaller cities in India. And of course, they've just built on that as time goes on.
Final question, Willy. Can we know what you've been up to since you retired from IndiGo? And when are we seeing you back in India?
Sure. Well, I've been doing a number of things. I mean, since I retired, I wanted more time to actually play veteran cricket in the summer before I get too old. So
Wow.
I've enjoyed a couple of summers in England doing that. And I've done also some consulting for a variety of people. I was up in Uzbekistan actually the year before last, and then last year I was in Hong Kong for 7 or 8 weeks helping a small airline there. And I do sort of ad hoc tasks for people. I sit on the Cirium on-time performance board, the Cirium, the airline analytics company. So a number of things, but I've also been writing a book on the cricket theme. It's the 100th year anniversary of a cricket club, the Stragglers of Asia, which I've been a member of for getting on for 50 years. And the Stragglers were actually founded in India, so it plays back into my sort of love of India. They were founded there in 1925, 100 years this year, and my book will be published at the end of April and available on Amazon. It's called One Arm Bowls a Little, which is a sort of, for me, an amusing sort of phrase, but it was a description of one of the first players of the Stragglers who had one arm and bowled a little, and he was described as such in the Secretary's Register of Players, and I was quite amused by that. So I've taken it as a title for my book, and it's basically the 100 years of the Stragglers of Asia Cricket Club. But it's a fascinating story. One of our members was actually assassinated by Indian freedom fighters in 1933. He was a district officer in Midnapur. And then, obviously, during the Second World War, a number of our members were killed in the service of the country. And then after the war, it's all about how the club transformed itself from being one for just sort of white colonial servants into, a fully inclusive, multiracial cricket club, which it is today, and still plays 25 or 30 games a year in the UK and a couple of games in Hong Kong. So that book will be out, and I hope that any listeners will look it up on Amazon. It'll be available there.
Awesome. That'll be something I'll be looking forward to. And of course, I think later in the year, the Indian cricket team visits England for I think 5
Yes.
match series.
Yes, we're all looking forward to that. Yeah, it will be a very tough series as usual. Obviously, we have the home advantage. So, yeah, no, but that'll be interesting. But you asked if I'm coming back to India. I'll be back certainly in October. There's an Asian aviation conference at the end of October, which I've been asked to run a panel on. And I will possibly be there around the time of the IATA meeting as well in June.
This has been such a pleasure. I cannot thank you enough for being so kind with your time and your incredible expertise about the business. Thank you, Willy.
Well, it's been a pleasure, Vishal. Thank you very much for the opportunity. And I hope people have enjoyed the small anecdotes I've had.
What an incredible conversation. There was still so much I wanted to ask Willy, but I'm keeping many of my other questions for another talk, hopefully down the road. For now, this is it, folks. Rate the show on your app, give us feedback, and feel free to press that follow button. I would appreciate that very much. Willy is not on X, but I am at Vishal1 Mehra. With that, I wish you well and happy flying, my friends.